Welcome, listeners, to our podcast, The Fruit of Their Labor. We're your hosts, Jasmine
and Robert.
In today's show, we'll begin with a brief overview discussing the history of Latino farm workers in the Pacific Northwest. After this introduction, we'll invite experts involved with PNW Farm Workers to educate us on contemporary issues.
In 1965, Cesar Chavez became an icon of progress as the farm worker who organized his Mexican-American community to strike against the injustices of the Delano grape growers in California. This collective effort became known as the United Farm Workers, the nation's most successful farm worker union currently present in 10 states. 2 years later, the UFW Co-op was founded in the Yakima Valley, but in recent decades, the union has had no power in the state of Washington as a result of the unique demographics and systemic injustices of the Pacific Northwest.
However, the history of Latino farm workers does not begin with Chavez. They have been an integral component of our agricultural landscapes since the early 1940s, when World War II created a shortage in the farm worker labor force of the Pacific Northwest. As a result of this shortage, the U.S. government created the Bracero program, a temporary contract labor program which caused the mass immigration of Mexican workers into the U.S. It is reported that 20% of the workers contracted under the Bracero program were sent to the Northwest alone. Unlike California, which had already relied heavily on a Latino agricultural workforce prior to the Bracero program, the Pacific Northwest experienced a radical change in the composition of their workforce. What used to be primarily a white, indigenous, and Asian immigrant agricultural workforce suddenly became predominantly Latino. Interestingly, the census statistics don't show such a significant change in Washington's Latino population until the 1970s. This can be attributed to the fact that tallies were taken in the spring, which avoided the peak summer season when many of the temporary and migrant farm workers were there.
Since the Latino population did not have a strong foothold in the cultural landscapes of the Northwest, the Bracero program proved to be futile. Growers distrusted the foreign workers, creating a detrimental work environment with poor living conditions and low wages. Farm workers suffered many illnesses such as tuberculosis and meningitis, as well as severe injuries from unsafe working practices. The Braceros were resilient and often stood up for their rights, going on strike for fair wages or deserting positions for better work environments. Unfortunately, this resistance caused Northwest farmers to pull out of the Bracero program, ending the Bracero program in 1947. Instead, farmers began to recruit Mexican migrants from Southwest states, such as California and Texas, continuing the migration of the Latino population to the north. Within a decade, the Latino population in Washington jumped from 7,000 to 17,600, creating Latino communities all throughout the Yakima Valley in cities such as Toppenish, Sunnyside, and Granger.
As early as 1910, there were unionization efforts in Washington under the Industrial Workers of the World. These early unionization efforts faced harsh repression from the state through physical fights and scare tactics. Largely unsuccessful, these initial efforts worked with the predominantly white migrant male workforce. On their own, Braceros initiated strikes through word of mouth as they learned of wage differences between camps. In the early 1960s, the rise of the United Farm Workers in California, as well as Lyndon B. Johnson's War on Poverty, began to set the stage for Latino farm worker organization in Washington state. As mandated by LBJ's War on Poverty policies, the Yakima Valley Council for Community began training Chicano and Chicana leaders in organization, creating the framework for El Movimiento. El Movimiento, or the movement, was synonymous for the combining forces of the Chicano movement and the growing prominence of the United Farm Workers in Washington state. This era saw the establishment of local workers' rights organizations, such as the UFW Co-op and the Mexican-American Federation in the Yakima Valley, as well as the Northwest Rural Opportunities in Granger. These organizations focused on a variety of issues, such as wage theft, community development, political advocacy, social and health services, as well as increasing Latino student enrollment at the UW.
With a new generation of Chicano students gaining the know-how of organizational work, many students began assisting farm workers in advocating for their rights. In 1970, Chicano students organized and led the first successful strike in the hop farms of the Yakima Valley. With the help of the UFW co-op, workers' wages were raised, but a long-lasting union was not established. The prominence of the UFW in Washington state began declining during these years as efforts were refocused on farm worker issues in California.
One of the primary successes in spite of the weakening Chicano movement was the formation of Radio Cadena, or KDNA, initially airing in 1979. As an activist and primarily Spanish-language radio station, Radio KDNA educated and advocated for farm workers. The collapse of the Mexican economy in 1982, as well as the political turmoil in Latin America, led to an increase in Latino immigration in the 1980s. At the same time, we also saw political conservatism under Ronald Reagan, which was realized in increased Immigration and Naturalization Service, or INS, raids in central Washington. Radio KDNA provided resources and information on raids, becoming a hub for central Washington immigrant farm workers and a nuisance to the INS. With Radio KDNA revitalizing union activity and providing communication to organize, it paved the way for the Washington State UFW to be formed in 1986. They worked on several strikes, with their most notable campaign at Chateau Ste. Michelle Winery, lasting 8 years and starting in 1987. Starting with a grassroots strike by workers there, they joined the UFW, becoming the first successful unionization effort in the state. In the coming years, the UFW of Washington had a multitude of successful organizational efforts for farm worker rights, but soon lost influence with low membership and diminishing funds.
Today's farm worker movement has been reignited with the formation of Familias Unidas por la Justicia, an independent farm worker union composed in Bellingham and working for fair wages in the Sakuma Brothers farms. After a series of nationwide boycotts on Sakuma Brothers produce, the corporation began listening to their workers, increasing wages, and preventing the hiring of H-2A foreign workers. With the end of the boycotts, Familias Unidas por la Justicia was established as the first farm worker union in Washington state in the last 30 years.
We will dedicate the rest of this podcast to discussing current issues on farm worker rights and inviting local experts in sharing their knowledge and experiences.
As a general background on Washington's physical landscape, farms are spread throughout Washington but have a much larger presence in central and eastern Washington. For our podcast, we talk about issues faced broadly across these physical and cultural landscapes, but utilize primarily experts on Yakima in central Washington and Skagit Valley in western Washington as two examples of farming communities.
To start off our discussions, we asked our experts what they believe made the Northwest unique when considering farm worker rights, in comparison to other regions such as the Central Valley of California. Joe Morrison from Columbia Legal Services, one of the primary legal aid organizations supporting Familias Unidas por la Justicia, highlighted how the demographics of Washington state play an important role in legal advocacy for farm workers.
The Washington state legislature and most legislative elected officials are Anglo-white folk, and there are very few Latino legislators and others in positions of power to be able to raise issues of farm workers. And so that goes hand in hand. The union has that connection to the legislative folks in California that allows them to make more progress on farm worker issues than you would say here in Washington state, where those connections are just not as strong, and the legislature doesn't reflect the changes that are happening in the community.
We also had the opportunity to speak with Dr. Victoria Breckwich-Vasquez, an assistant professor in the School of Nursing and Health Studies at UW-Bothell. Her research is centered around Latino community health with an emphasis on farm workers in the Yakima Valley. She expressed how the culture of the PNW has made progress in farm worker rights extremely difficult.
I think of the Pacific Northwest and have been talking to people who have tried to organize the Pacific Northwest union-wise, trying to organize farmers in Pacific Northwest for at least 4 decades. And as I understand it, the Pacific Northwest has a huge impediment in that farmers are extremely anti-union up here. And that really it really stops efforts that are farm worker based. So we need a lot more attention, whereas in California, you've got a lot more organizing that has been successful. UFW tried here in the 50s and 60s and were not able to have a stronghold. We have only one farm worker union in the Pacific Northwest. Two unions. Cocoon in Oregon and Familias Unidas in Bellingham that I feel are extremely small compared to the need, but amazingly effective when given the chance to represent farm workers.
Now we'll dive into the environmental issues that these workers face. One of the foundations for this discussion is how we define the environment. We asked our experts how farm workers relate to the environment and any differences there might be between their definition and more traditional definitions. Jose Ortiz is a former farm worker who worked in the fields until he was 18. Now he works at St. Charles Church in Burlington in the Skagit Valley and with the Tri-Parish Food Bank there, where he works with volunteers to provide food to anyone who needs it. This and his work with the food bank as it was developing have involved advocacy for the migrant farm worker community, ultimately leading to a great deal of understanding for the conditions and history of farm workers in his area. In terms of the environment, Jose told us that Latino farm workers love working with the land and taking care of it. Like Native Americans here, they respect everything around them. Mary Gilbert is a parishioner at Holy Family Catholic Church in Kirkland who was introduced through church to the Tri-Parish Food Bank and has since gotten extremely involved with the migrant farm worker community. She volunteers 2 to 3 times a week there and has served on the board of the food bank since 2008. She has also taken several trips to countries in Latin America to further understand the reasons and to help the people who leave their countries for farm work in the U.S.
I think it's like they have a relationship with the environment and almost like a very intimate understanding of the environment. And it's almost their friend. They really, I have a friend that has, that works up there in the potato fields, and his name is Juan. And to even have conversations with him about his work and to listen to him about his work, it's different because the working in the fields and working so closely with the land, you really see that it's, in his words, there's an intimacy, there's a closeness there, there's an understanding there.
One of the main occupational health issues for farm workers in the fields is pesticide exposure. Our experts had a unified belief that the main concerns were lack of education on safe practices as well as policy on drift, the process by which pesticides are spread to neighboring fields and community areas as a result of wind. Jose told us that oftentimes they don't know how to read the instructions for the pesticides they're spraying. It's really worrisome, and on top of that, there aren't any laws to notify nearby areas when airplanes spray pesticides. Airplanes spray next to community areas like schools and churches, and with smells lasting for days, it's a big concern.
The main gap that exists here that we tried to fix through legislation is twofold. One is through most of drift incidents involve workers or people at neighboring farms. So while they, at the farm where the pesticides are being applied, they may be having the person have personal protective equipment on, and the workers may be out of the field where it's being sprayed, but they haven't notified their neighbors about the application. And so when drift happens and workers are close by in nearby fields, those workers get impacted. And so we've had a proposed law that would require growers to notify their neighbors when they're spraying so that their neighbors would be able to keep people out of harm's way. And that has run into significant barriers,
I think the biggest issue right now on that is policy on drift and pesticide drift because of wind. I think there are many people who are against that, and for 3 years that I've been tracking that kind of legislation and those kinds of motions by very smart people, including lawyers, that are trying to get notifications out and get a common notification database out. I can't imagine why people are so against it beyond the small cost that I imagine somebody's going to have to front to get the database and to get people to actually contribute their information in the database, to be called, to be on the call list should a neighboring farm be applying pesticides. I feel like unless we have legislators that are educated about how important this is, unless we have common citizens, common voters here that are concerned about farm worker health for real, and their exposures on a chronic basis as well as on a emergency basis where they have to go and get acute care. I think the chronic exposure is much more is much more in need of our attention than the acute exposure, because I feel like it has a lot more implications for developmental disease, as well as a lot of chronic illness that are potentially ruining and decreasing the quality of life of many farm workers over many, many years, and potentially passing it on to their children and next generations.
In addition to pesticide exposure, the specific crops and agricultural industries of Washington state create unique experiences and issues for the farm workers of this region. David Morales, a staff attorney for the legal advocacy organization known as the Northwest Justice Project, explained how Washington's heavy dependence on hops and dairy farms greatly impacts the health of farm workers and Latino communities.
The Yakima Valley grows about 70% of the nation's hops because of the particular nature or the characteristics of the land. And that means that we have very high concentrations of a fruit that is basically built to make pollen, and very dangerous pollen. And so you'll see statistics dealing with the hops that are absolutely mind-boggling, with huge amounts of the workers being affected by respiratory problems, mostly from being in the hop industry. So I think that's one thing that's unique. We have a very high concentration in the lower Yakima Valley of what are known as concentrated animal feeding operations, which are, I don't know what to call it, except massive tracts of dirt on which many, many thousands of cows live. And the result is manure lagoons, and we don't have regulation right now that requires them entirely to be to have layers under them. So we're talking about possible seepage of manure into the waterways. So you end up with well water that ends up being very high in nitrate content in the lower valley, and this mostly affects people who receive their water from wells, which around these parts tends to be homeowners or renters in the lower Yakima Valley. So you have very high concentrations of nitrate among that population.
With the accumulation of these health issues among farm worker communities in the PNW, the next barrier that is faced is access to proper health care. As Joe and David explained, the lack of knowledge and reporting on pesticide exposure not only impacts an individual's health, but also their organization's ability to advocate for change within these issues.
Farm workers, when they get really sick, will ultimately go to the doctor. And the doctors, especially in rural Washington, aren't as trained as they could be on issues of pesticides, and the studies haven't really been done to be able to link certain chemicals to certain diseases. And so if the reporting were done on a more regular basis, the researchers could connect with the agencies and try and connect the dots that might show that, well, this one community in, let's just say, Mattawa is experiencing certain rates of cancer. Well, why is that? Well, maybe it's because of the chemicals that are being sprayed all around them on a regular basis.
There aren't enough doctors who specialize in pesticide exposure to be able to allow us to set up the evidence to prove a case against a particular employer or a particular industry or group of employers.
On the other hand, the training of rural physicians on pesticide exposure may be more easily attainable in comparison to policies preventing negative pesticide exposure in the first place.
There are resources, there's lots of training manuals, there's lots of stuff out there. It just has to do with more putting some of these webinars together and offering CME and CNE for providers. I don't see that that's such a complicated thing, dealing with pesticides from a provider standpoint. Dealing with pesticides from how a farm worker experiences drift. I think we've got some big challenges on the policy level that I think are much more impactful, could be much more impactful on many, many more farm workers than, again, waiting until people are exposed and going to the hospital from exposure. We've got some big time prevention to be thinking about, and somehow we're just not orienting ourselves to prevention.
In addition to all the worries of health conditions, the living conditions have been abysmal. Jose has addressed the poverty in the community and terrible conditions in the worker housing. From Jose's personal experience, even though he grew up poor in Mexico, coming to the U.S. and seeing the conditions here was a shock. It was like being in another country, and the workers came in with no clue what life was like. In the original food bank that operated out of the trunk of a priest's car, about 50 people could come to the car to get food, but there was only enough food for 5 to 10. He also found that through advocacy, they have seen improvements but still have a ways to go. He explains that in some ways, since we've been here a long time and had a great deal of advocacy in the Skagit Valley, there's been a lot of positive changes, particularly in farm worker housing. This has included increasing from 1 to 2 windows to allow flow of air, added privacy to showers to avoid kids showering alone with adults, and inspections to avoid pee being left on the floor of bathrooms. In fact, worker housing used to be a shack with bare plywood walls and a tin roof. Rain would drip through the sheet metal and fall in the middle of the room, and families would have to put up plastic to prevent it from falling on their belongings and themselves. In our research, we've also found that the working conditions are incredibly difficult and demanding. Farm workers have historically had to fight for such basic labor rights as work breaks. Mary tells us a story of how they still have difficulties over parents getting time off.
Gabriel married a woman named Alicia, and they are both undocumented here. And so through that, I got to know them. And so I would see them come and help at the food bank, but they would also come for service with their very, very stained hands after a day of hard work. Mm-hmm. Well, then they were married and had children, and their second child, when she was born, Gabriel was working when the daffodil season was. And so he was picking the daffodils, but I don't know if you've ever noticed on the daffodils, they always have the rubber band that goes around the stems of the bouquet. Mm-hmm. Well, they time the farm workers, and whoever can tie those rubber bands the quickest gets the job. And so he was doing that work, but their daughter, Fabiola, was born one evening, and then the next day he had to go to work. Well, if he wasn't able to go and pick up the daughter from the hospital. So it was a day of food bank service. So I went with another volunteer, and we went to the hospital to pick up his wife and baby. Because if he would have left his job, he would have lost his job. Wow. And so that was the only work that their family had. So we go to the hospital there up in Mount Vernon, and we've become friends, in this time. Well, then I learned that they don't have a car seat to bring the baby home. So then I stop and get a car seat and then go back to the hospital. But, it was such an honor to be able to help their family in that manner. But to see that I have my own kids, my own family, but I didn't need to worry about my husband losing his job with caring for our family at the very beginning when all of that was happening. So I always think about that when I see those bouquets of daffodils in front of a grocery store,
right.
In the spring, and I think someone tied those rubber bands on those daffodils,
mm-hmm.
and that person has a story, just like my friend Gabriel and his wife Alicia have their story that particular season when their daughter was born.
We had the opportunity to speak with Juan, a 15-year-old farm worker who started working in the fields around the age of 9. He was born in California, but his family originally immigrated from El Jicaral, Oaxaca. When he has time, he goes to work at the Sakuma Farms in Burlington after school and works full-time during his summer vacation. He usually works in the fields with both his mother and sisters, but his family moves around Washington depending on work opportunities. He shared with us that the treatment from his employers differed amongst farms. For example, he preferred working in a cucumber farm where the treatment from the employers was less stressful in comparison to strawberry fields. He also explained that it is very common for young children, starting at the age of 10, to begin working in the fields with their families. Juan lives with his family in housing provided by Sakuma Brothers Farms, which is a small cabin, and expressed that it was uncomfortable to live and eat in such a small space. As a student, he shared that one of the most difficult parts about attending school is his ability to stay awake during class. Teachers often believe that Juan and his sisters are being lazy when in fact they are sleep deprived from their work in the fields. Juan and his family are actively involved with Familias Unidas por la Justicia, and they have participated in 8-mile marches as well as regular meetings. The major improvement that he's noticed as a result of the union has been the betterment of wages. When Juan and his family first moved to Washington, it was very intimidating for them to go out into the community since they did not know anyone. He notices that Trump's immigration policies is reigniting this fear and intimidation amongst his community members, preventing them from going to work and seeking proper medical care in order to avoid deportation. When asked how he would want to improve conditions for his community, Juan expressed that he wanted to open up more opportunities for Latinos to pursue their life goals. He believed that an immediate improvement for his community would be to teach the youth how to speak English in order to overcome English barriers. Since so many aspects of life, including work-related documents, are often in English, it's essential for someone in the family to know English. Translating takes time, but having a child who knows English places farm worker families at an advantage for job opportunities and wage negotiation. Our conversation with Juan was very insightful and added some new aspects that our other experts weren't able to touch on.
With the new administration's immigration policy, we've seen the effects across the country with the so-called Muslim ban. President Trump's plans to build a wall across the Mexican border has told a clearer story on the administration's views on Latino immigrants. Today, we see tightening of the border and increased immigration enforcement, which has made farm workers extremely worried about their ability to stay in the country. This policy threatens the livelihoods of the farm workers involved and seems to be troublesome for the country at large because these policies cut into the main makeup of our agricultural workforce. As Jose explained to us, around the election, many people called in, crying and worried that immigration enforcement would come after them. Kids in junior high and high school were really impacted too, since they saw their parents worried about their whole livelihood and potentially having to go back home. Jose recalled that during the season when labor was needed, the Border Patrol weren't really present. However, after the work was done, there was a strong presence. They didn't take away many people, but it's obviously a political game.
Why are people making these desperate moves and almost putting your own selves in those? If that was my family, I would be doing the exact same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's disheartening to me at this point that not asking those questions. They believe that the living conditions of where they come from, they have no other choice. And it's, I believe, desperate people making heroic decisions to have a better life. And if they were to choose, they would want to live in their home country and stay there and be all united with their families. But the families are divided. People are making, just like I say, heroic decisions to live, to survive.
With the tightening of the border and with especially the crackdown that's going on now, where everyone, regardless of whether they have a criminal history, anyone who's using a Social Security number that isn't their own could be considered a threat under the current administration. And so there is immigration enforcement going up. There is a reduction in the current workforce that's here. There are fewer people crossing the border, so that is drying up the labor that's available. And on top of that, you've got agriculture that continues to expand at this rapid rate without any planning for how they're going to have that work done in the future, and hoping that the federal government just bails them out through this, what is called the H-2A guest worker program.
Our administration just had conversations with farmers on the 15th of May in D.C. And farmer organizations, owners, growers, represented really well, 14 or 15 of them, represented well their interests to the current president and his administration, and they let him know that they're concerned about several things. One is they're concerned about the availability of workers if the farm worker workforce is going to be targeted for deportation. And they let him know that, in fact, they are very interested in the ability of sanctuary cities and sanctuary areas, regions, around their agricultural areas, because they want farm workers to have some kind of protection. So, there are interests involved, certainly. There's an interest involved there from their end about having a stable workforce and having workers that they can count on, right? And their bottom line is productivity and how much money can they make in their business.
One of the specific issues that migrant farm workers face is the issue of documentation. For undocumented workers, the fear of deportation back to often dangerous situations makes immigration an even more pressing issue for them. Mary Gilbert also told us undocumented farm workers have a real threat of deportation. She has seen firsthand that some of the kids are afraid to go to school because they're afraid their parents won't be there when they come home.
He was an accountant, a CPA in Guatemala, and fled there because he had to, because they were wanting him to run drug money. And so he came with his family for freedom and peace. And now he spends many, many years working in the potato fields very hard and loves his work, loves his community there, and is so grateful to be here.
Jose added to our discussion that the most pressing issue facing migrant farm workers is their legal status. Not knowing what's going to happen to them from one moment to the next takes over their thoughts. We need a way to help the workers who are hardworking, with a clean record, and in the area for many years. He said that once they become legal residents, they invest back in the community and progress. They're immigrants like the rest of us.
As a result of the current administration's crackdown on immigration, our agricultural industry is being impacted with a decreasing workforce, and the present solution is the H-2A program, which provides temporary visas for foreign agricultural workers. Our experts highlighted the major downfalls of this program as a form of dispossession and a violation of human rights. Jose expressed that if the program's rules were followed as intended, it would be something people preferred because they could work for a few months and go back home. However, in reality, they're treated like slaves. They're isolated from the regular local farm workers and have better wages and housing, which has created a lot of friction between the H-2A workers and local workers.
There'll be more approvals of applications, more conditional waivers. The employers could bring workers in without necessarily meeting all of the regulations, all the health and safety regulations of the housing. I expect that Congress would pass laws to deregulate some of the aspects of H-2A and make it easier for employers to bring in more workers. And that isn't necessarily bad in of itself, to the extent that I would probably acknowledge that there are some places in Eastern Washington where there truly are shortages of workers. But we've seen in a number of cases where really the H-2A workers are being brought in order to replace the local workforce. And so the second you get local workers, it becomes much harder for the second you get the H-2A workers, it becomes much harder for the local workers to get jobs or to keep their jobs. And so they end up getting, where before they have green warnings, they had all these trainings, suddenly it's like, do this in 16 seconds or we'll fire you.
What the growers really want to do is disrupt old hiring patterns. And so people that have had jobs for many years, worked loyally for the company, they're often looking to really replace them with these foreign workers who are brought in on contracts that they never see or have any ability to negotiate on, and are really loath to raise any complaints, because if the employer hears about them complaining to us or to other places or trying to enforce their rights, they'll simply tell the contractor in Mexico, don't bring this person back. And so the H-2A workers are very much, some reports have said that they are close to slavery because they just simply don't feel that they can assert rights when their wages or other working conditions don't match the promises that have been made to them, because they know they've probably paid a recruitment fee, they're trying to pay them off, their families are waiting on the money back in Mexico, they have to keep their head down and keep working and not complain. And in their hearts, they're thinking maybe someday this will turn into some sort of citizenship or legal status. But the reality of the H-2A program is it is not an immigration program. It's simply a work visa that gets allowed for a temporary period, and then the worker gets sent home.
So why are we allowing this to happen? What are the real benefits of hiring H-2A workers over dedicated domestic workers? David has several hunches, including the grower's ability to avoid legal issues with undocumented domestic workers and a loophole for discriminatory hiring processes.
I would venture to guess that you have several different things. One of them is risk management, with the Trump administration really pushing the issue of undocumented workers. Some employers may fear that because some of their workforce is probably undocumented, that they don't want to push their luck by having undocumented workers, and therefore they want to get rid of everybody because they cannot necessarily tell who is a documented worker, who is an undocumented worker. There is certain forms of discrimination being practiced within the recruitment of H-2A workers that wouldn't be allowed in the United States, because we see H-2A workers as mostly really tall, really young men who are very athletic. And you compare them to local farm workers, and you get a very wide variety. Older people, younger people, men and women, all kinds of health, all kinds of heights. But you talk to H-2A workers, and they're very uniform.
The contradictory crackdown on immigration while importing more foreign laborers to replace domestic workers is illogical. Through this process, the displacement of Latino communities will not only fragment the agricultural industry, but also add to the historical trauma experienced by Latinos nationwide.
Is it better off for us as a state to be hiring and employing all people who want to have jobs in agriculture, making sure that they're being paid decent, safe wages for their families so that communities are built up here? Or do we want to simply import our labor, have them come in for a period of time, bust them around, and send them home? Is that what we want? Communities of large groups of single men isolated from their families and isolated from protections and resources in these, labor camps all around the area, with no right to participate in our communities and building them up and participating in the democracy that is our region.
In addition to the immediate needs of the Latino agricultural workforce, we also need to readdress our nation's agricultural industry and its potential to be a just and viable food system. Without consideration for sustainability, growth management, and our cultural connection with food, the future of agriculture globally will be compromised.
One of the other big exemptions that agriculture has is that there's no requirement that they go through a growth management process whenever they plant new orchards. And I really think that is a major gap in what we have going on in Washington State. If somebody wants to come in and build a new hotel or a new mall or a large tract of housing, they have to be able to show that it fits into a variety of plans for sustainability, for the long run, for the county, for the state, whatever. And for ag, you don't have to do that. And so how can we continue to just allow that development to happen without the thought about how we're going to feed, house, clothe, educate, transport the workers that need to come in and work there, and what's the impact on the communities in terms of water and other chemicals and other things like that. So that's, I think, another big gap that we as a state are not grappling with unless we have agriculture tied into those planning processes. Ultimately, we're going to just reach a breaking point.
Potentially having trade agreements with other places that such as Mexico, that actually don't favor Mexican products, but favor our own subsidizing of staples that they once depended on. So lots of negative impacts are coming to farm workers who were once in their land, once might have had land, and were potentially growing their own food and also growing to sell. Many of them have lost their ability to have their own land and have migrated for many reasons, but many of them come to the U.S. and unfortunately are working in this agribusiness that has led to their own landlessness. So we've got a big sort of problem that relates directly to farm workers. I'm not sure how we're going to solve that, because I think it has a lot to do with re-educating the American population and the global population about how this big commercialization is actually reducing the importance of food as a healing substance, of food as a sharing practice, of what makes life special in the sharing and growing of food.
Rosalinda Guillen is a past farm worker and current executive director of Community to Community, a nonprofit in Bellingham promoting Latino immigrant rights and food sovereignty. She was one of the head organizers of the Chateau Ste. Michelle winery strike, which started in 1987. She is currently dedicated to empowering farm workers as leaders in the work to improve our food system.
My father used to say, growing food is a sacred task. It's a profession. It's a knowledge. And he was a professional farm worker, and he was very proud of it. He was never ashamed of being a farm worker. So it's the life that I have led, that my brothers and sisters and my father have led. It's what we know. It's what's core to who we are as people, as a family. And so it is very important to me to try to fix this, and to try to improve it, to try to look for ways that other people will live better by being farm workers. We are not saying, like many organizations and many other political leaders and farm worker leaders talk about, moving farm workers out of farm work into progress or career enhancement or success, which is only translated out of agriculture. What we want to do is ensure that farm workers are respected within agriculture for what we do, which is helping the industry to raise food. We are core to the production of food. Farm workers have keys to the improvement of the food system in the United States, to protecting the soil, protecting Mother Earth, but also feeding people in a healthy manner. And I believe farm workers should stay in farm work, but they should be respected for it, valued for it, and paid for it. We need better wages, better treatment, and we need to be recognized in this country just like the farmers are recognized.
As those who are listening, Mary Gilbert is a community member. We asked her how she got involved in these issues and what she thinks we as community members can do to affect change. Her testimony and actions improve upon the traditional narrative of communities that ignore or even add to the injustices faced by marginalized groups.
I think that if we sit back and wait for someone else to do it, or bigger government to do it, it's not going to happen. But we can help. It's more of really listening to the needs of the people that are living on in those marginalized situations, and getting a lens into their lives, and then working with them, advocating alongside them, and keeping in mind always how best can we come together to help this situation. You know, people want the low prices of the produce. They want the crops to be picked, but they don't look at the people that are behind all of that, and the humanity of the people that are behind all of that.
Right.
And so I think that there's almost a pass by, or there's not even a glance given to the people. Or as we go and shop in our grocery stores and we want low prices of fruit and vegetables, but we don't even enter into the thought of the consideration of the person that picked these and their own situation of their family. And, I think we all desire to work hard and earn a just wage for the work that we do. But the value, it seems like there's a lack of even entering into wanting to value that, the migrant farm workers and the work that they do, and to give them the dignity and the value for the work that they do.
Mary has actually been involved in education to help bridge this gap in understanding between the diverse communities that produce and consume produce in the Pacific Northwest. Here, she described one inspirational story of a student who realized the connection between the food she got in the store and its source through working with the plants in a community garden.
She thought all of the food, we were out there and we were gleaning the garden, and she had made a comment, and at first we thought she was kidding, but she said, "I thought everything grew at Safeway." And one of her fellow students said, just kind of laughed, and she goes, "Actually, I wasn't kidding. I never thought about things grew in a garden or grew outside." And, it might be funny, but there was just this, obviously when she left there, and she really expanded upon that during our wrap-up session of just how this had really broadened her small understanding, narrow understanding. And she said, "I'm embarrassed to say this, but even just a half day being here and serving and being out in that garden has totally changed my understanding."
Jo further explains how community members become more engaged, but takes a different approach. Just as consumers have played a role in boycotts like the one the Sakuma brothers faced, he addresses our power as consumers to use what we buy as a tool to fight for better worker conditions.
I go to the store and I think organic or not. And I think, well, why shouldn't I pay more for organic? Perhaps it's better for me, but it's also better for the people, hopefully, who are working in the fields, right? Mm-hmm. So I should vote with my money every time I go to the store. And that's pretty well established to some degree. We can tell in the store what fruit is perhaps grown in a more safe environment, not only for the worker, but for the person who's the consumer of that product. Well, what if we demanded that employers who are producing food through H2A, use of H2A workers, also had to disclose that? How would people react if they knew that, what it was like for the typical H2A worker to be employed who has fewer rights than actually undocumented workers? Mm-hmm. What if people knew that? How would they react? Would they buy fruit and vegetables produced through H2A labor, or would they decide, I'm not going to do that? So I think that the consumer has a lot of power.
As we've seen through our panel of experts, Latino farm workers have historically faced extremely harsh treatment in the environment, living, and working conditions. In the Pacific Northwest, hard-fought improvements have been the result of strikes, individual action, and advocacy groups. The work of allies and migrant farm workers together in recent years has bettered the conditions, but there is still a far way to go. As community members and a country, we must recognize the integral role Latino farm workers hold in American agriculture and address the unique problems that they face. It is only if we do that we can create a sustainable agriculture industry for the country and the people therein. Thank you for tuning in, and join us next time on The Fruit of Their Labor.